everyone. I just want to introduce myself really quick before we start. My name is Heather. I'm the new IAC coordinator for Israel engagement at Clark University. Hello. It's so great to be with you all. I'm going to be the room monitor for this session. So if any of you have any trouble with the technology or anything else, feel free to send me a private message in the chat, or my boyfriend Luke Haberman, who also is on this call. And it is great to see you, Rabbi Aviva Feldman. Thank you so much for being here. And we just had a wonderful services at Clark led by someone who was in one of your classes on how to lead a service. So
Great.
Big thank you to you. It was beautiful.
Great. And it's nice to finally sort of meet you in a different format.
Yes, you too.
All right, we're going to start in just a couple seconds. All right, it's 9 o'clock. We'll begin. What we're going to aim to do in this class together is to look at Jewish views on abortion. I have a couple caveats to say off the bat, which is this is a difficult topic. And it potentially hits very close to home for some of us on the call. Current statistics state about 1 in 3 American women have had an abortion, however you define abortion. And with that in mind, please be careful not to probe into any personal experiences. The other piece is that we are going to focus specifically on texts and how those texts have been understood over time. We're looking at Torah texts, we're looking at Mishnah texts, and we'll look at some contemporary writings as well. One of the things that we will see is, as most things in Judaism, there are multiple levels of interpretation and methods of interpretation. So this is not to present an authoritative, but I hope that by breaking down the sources a little bit, we can start to rebuild them in a way that both narrows and widens what the texts are talking about for us. So we're going to start with the Torah. The first mitzvah listed in the Torah, the very first commandment we have, is be fruitful and multiply and increase the earth. So the first mitzvah in the Torah sets the stage for our debate. Because just from this alone, we could try to understand that every opportunity for a birth should be taken as a mitzvah. Because if the point of humans on earth is to procreate, thereby every potential procreation or result from should be a commandment. So how does this first mitzvah influence our thoughts? It can either just be, yes, that's our goal and we do it to the best of our ability, or that there's an actual obligation. The conversation potentially shifts greatly when we move to Exodus. Can I get a volunteer to read this in the English? Go ahead, Bobby.
When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage, ason, ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according to as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
Okay, so how do we understand the word mishap or damage, ason, in these verses? Feel free to unmute yourselves and join in the conversation.
So to me, it seems that ason is a bigger deal, bigger tragedy than the miscarriage, whatever that is.
So you could read this as, if all that happens is a miscarriage and there's no potential permanent damage, then the results are different than if there is damage to the wife or mother.
Also, it seems like the way the text is written, you can measure other damage than a miscarriage. You're not allowed to, or you can't measure the damage of a miscarriage.
Right.
I see here in the line that says, if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, that the miscarriage first mentioned doesn't fall into that category.
Well, ostensibly, right? So two things. One is, ostensibly you can't cause a miscarriage in the other person, especially if they're not pregnant. But the other piece is that we can read from this that a miscarriage is not a permanent thing. And it's not a guaranteed thing. And it's potentially, even then, was known to happen regularly. So 1 in 4 pregnancies end up in a miscarriage, most often before the woman even knows that she's pregnant. And so that notion of something that might happen anyway, happening as a result of direct action, sets different parameters than any damage that might affect future ability to procreate.
So the other thing that I find interesting in this is that the husband gets to decide what the fine should be. So the husband sort of owns the body and the fetus, or the woman sort of doesn't have any say.
So good point. That is very biblical. So a little word about marriage and relationships in biblical times, that in a traditional Jewish wedding between a heteronormative couple, the husband acquires exclusive rights to the woman's sexuality in the marriage. And girls were property who belonged to their fathers until that property was transferred to their husbands at the time of their wedding. A Jewish divorce or a get undoes that exclusive ownership. And part of that process is the husband saying, and now you are free to any other person. They give up their exclusive rights as part of that process. Now, we could call that incredibly problematic today, and there are all sorts of workarounds and changes and adaptations to wedding ceremonies to accommodate both non-heteronormative couples, but also couples who find this notion very problematic. Before my wedding to my husband, which I felt very strongly should be as traditional as possible, I looked at him and said, listen, buddy, if I wasn't okay with this, this would not be happening. So I want you to know that I consent. But we also tried to have as egalitarian language as we could in our ketubah. And when he said, like, what should we put down for the monetary amount that's listed as the wife's worth in the ketubah, I said, you can't afford me. Don't put down a set number. And actually, what the text ends up saying is that the courts will decide any sort of monetary amounts should it come to that. But you can't afford me in goats or camels or anything else, nor might you want to. So the word ason, yeah, Patty.
So I also think that there's not an easy way to prove that pushing a woman results in the miscarriage. In other words, the woman might have miscarried anyway, and the miscarriage might not happen immediately, where the other external physical damage that they mention is obvious at the time of the incident.
Right. The other piece is that they seem to hold the life of the woman above any potential miscarriage, whether actually caused by the incident or otherwise. That the penalties where life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc., come in are when the woman's life is harmed. So the next slide, that before I turn to it, how we translate the word ason has a lot to do with our understanding of the whole issue at hand. So on the next slide, we're going to see both the Septuagint translation and the Vulgate as a way that Jewish and early Christian texts understood it, and how that may have led to rifts between the understandings. Volunteer to read the Septuagint. And as we read them, think about how the different translations indicate different approaches. Bobby, go ahead.
The Septuagint, the 3rd century BCE Greek translation of the Bible by Jewish sages. If two men are fighting and a pregnant woman is stuck in her belly and her child comes out not fully formed, he shall pay a fine. As the woman's husband shall impose, he shall pay it with the valuation. But if it is fully formed, he shall give a soul for a soul, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burning for a burning, a wound for a wound, a stripe for a stripe. I don't understand that at all. If it is fully formed, isn't it healthy?
So excellent question, and you're headed in sort of the right direction.
Okay.
When we read the passages from Exodus, our entire conversation about this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth had to do with the woman, not the fetus. And the Septuagint already seems to make a distinction between a fully formed fetus and a not fully formed fetus. Not about the woman. How about the Vulgate?
The Vulgate, the 4th century CE Latin translation of the Bible by early Christians, so that's 700 years later, right? If men were fighting and someone struck a pregnant woman and she miscarried, but she herself lived, he will be subject to a fine, as much as the woman's husband shall request and as the judges decree. If, however, her death shall follow, let him pay a soul for a soul, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burning for a burning, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise.
Oh, okay.
So how might these different readings fit in to the abortion debate?
Would you repeat the question?
How might these different readings play into the abortion debate?
Well, the woman is valued more, right? It seems in both.
So the woman's not part of the Septuagint. She's not a consideration. In fact, it breaks up the text a little bit differently. But if it is fully formed, he shall give her a soul for a soul. So if we go back, let me see if I can get back. Here, right? The one responsible shall be fined according to the woman's husband may extract from him. The payment is to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, The Septuagint understands this as other damages to the fetus in a condition other than potential miscarriage. In other words, it could be anything from early onset labor, right? Think about the different things that could cause a premature birth, where today that fetus or baby might live, depending on how we define it when it comes out and how far along in the pregnancy it is. It may also have to do with whether the wife dies in childbirth, which was much more common than it is in some communities today. But the whole notion that they're talking about very different things being eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So the next text we're going to look at is from the Mishnah. It's about ending a fetus's life when the mother's life is in danger. Volunteer to read. Luke, go ahead.
Thank you. If a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and brings it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. But if the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another.
So how do we define life?
It seems to me that there's a threshold that needs to be crossed within the womb.
Okay.
Life is something that occurs outside the womb, and not the fetus is not a life until more than half of the fetus has come out.
Any other comments? So the first time I learned this text, I was told that as soon as the head comes out, they are of equal importance, the life of each. That until the head emerges, in other words, until the child or the newborn has the potential to breathe on its own, it is merely an extension of the mother's body, but the mother's life is guaranteed and the fetus's life is not. And once the head is out and that fetus has the potential to breathe on its own, the outside world, all of a sudden, both lives are important. Then it's considered life. So you could ask about breech babies or anything else. We're not going to go down that road. But the notion of that until that baby begins to be born, the mother's life takes precedence is a firm belief in Judaism. Which doesn't necessarily say that abortion is okay, but it definitely opens up that door. The other thing that this does is acknowledges how hard childbirth would be. In other words, we're not talking about a 20-week anatomy scan that presents issues that would affect the ability of a child to live. We're actually talking what would be called in political worlds today, like end of pregnancy abortion. That if we define abortion as ending the life of the fetus, this says in childbirth, if the mother is having difficulty, the prerogative is to get that fetus out no matter what in an attempt to save the mother's life. But once that birth has started, i.e. the head is out, All of a sudden, we're dealing with life and life. So now that we've done this one, I just want to go back for a minute to the Exodus text. Does this change at all how we understand this this text from Exodus in terms of ason? Volunteer to read it again.
I'll read.
Thank you, Deb.
When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ason ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ason ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
So now do we understand this a little bit differently?
So does it mean that, I mean, they use miscarriage, but that could also just be the fetus is born. So that if in fact it's
right, so the Hebrew
born alive, it starts to breathe, then there's a different set of penalties.
Right, so the Hebrew says, Veyatzu yeladeha, and the child came out of her.
So it doesn't mean what we think of as miscarriage. It's a different, that's not a great translation. It's an imperfect translation.
Correct. Yet we could understand that as if you're defining widely what miscarriage is.
Right.
Right? It's a birth that doesn't result in a live child.
Right.
Or a non-live birth. So now, other commentators. So Rashi, an 11th century commentator, comments to a different segment in Sanhedrin: as long as the child did not come out into the world, it is not called a living being. And it is therefore permissible to take its life in order to save the life of its mother. Once the head of the child has come out, the child may not be harmed because it is considered as fully born, and one life may not be taken to save another. So Rashi picks up on that birth piece mentioned in Oholot, but defines it and fleshes it out a little bit more completely. Maimonides, volunteer to read Maimonides.
I can read it.
Please.
This is also one of the negative commandments, that we are not allowed to show mercy for the life of a pursuer. Consequently, the sages ruled that when a pregnant woman has life-threatening difficulty giving birth, one may dismember the child in her womb, either with drugs or by surgery, because he is like a pursuer, seeking to kill her. Once his head has emerged, however, he may not be touched, for we do not set aside one life for another, and he is not considered her pursuer, for this is the natural course of the world. And then as an asterisk, the category of pursuer comes from the laws of murder and self-defense. One is permitted to kill a pursuer if that person is trying to kill you.
Okay, so one of the things here is the issue of rodef. Rodef is the word that they use for pursuer. And just a note about this text that we're not actually going to look at, but I'll tell you about, is the rodef text was the text used to try to justify Yitzhak Rabin's assassination. That a pursuer who is coming to do harm to you, you're obligated to take their life before they do that harm. And for some, the potential for peace and agreeing and making peace was seen as a potential harm for life, and there was a seen obligation in taking that life first. So the idea of a pursuer is if somebody is coming, a rodef is coming into your home, think a robber at night, you are obligated to act in self-defense. But it gets so tricky when the questions are asked, but did they have a weapon? Is it during the day different than at night? Is it your perceived threat or actual threat? And at what point does that threat no longer exist? In other words, if your house was robbed and nobody's still there, and you see somebody who resembles the perpetrator on the street, are they still a pursuer? Or only when they were in the act? And there are huge Talmudic and halachic debates about this. But Maimonides is using a very different case. So what is Maimonides saying? When a pregnant woman has a life-threatening difficulty giving birth, one may dismember the child in her womb, either with drugs or by surgery, because it is like a rodef. They put the condition of rodef in where it wasn't part of Ohalot or the Rashi or the Torah text that we saw in Exodus. And this notion of rodef heightens but changes the nature of the view on abortion a little bit. So the two medieval commentators have different perspectives on when or why one might be permitted to dismember a fetus during a difficult childbirth. For Rashi, one can only dismember a fetus when it has not fully emerged, for one life cannot be sacrificed for another. Thus, for Rashi, the unborn fetus is not fully alive. In contrast, Rambam considers the fetus when it is in the womb to be a pursuer, a rodef, so it can be dismembered to save the life. Thus, for Rambam, in doing this, the unborn fetus is considered a person, because only a person could be a rodef. So all of a sudden, an attempt to allow abortions to occur, all of a sudden start to narrow the categories and understanding of what a potential abortion would be. So now we're gonna, before we do this, any questions up to here? Because we're gonna shift to contemporary views. Are you following Ish?
Aviva, I guess that what I find fascinating, which I'd never thought about because I'm familiar with the sources, is how we're resting some of what we've evolved over the centuries on Maimonides. And I know Maimonides gets often a bad rap for sort of just kind of randomly pulling laws and connecting things just because he feels like it. But this is an example of that, where he's made a connection between two very different categories of law. And now we're living with sort of the consequences of his joining dots that never needed to be joined.
Right.
And there's benefits and there's also challenges with what he did.
So I feel like sometimes I tend to be a Maimonides where I pull examples from something totally unrelated to try to make a point. And I hope that they're not taken out of context, but I really can't control that. And so the notion of rodef in the Mishnah really is like somebody who is directly threatening your life. And the fact that they would even put this in a category on a fetus when it doesn't change what he's actually saying at all opens up a whole realm of problem and problematic attitude, because now we've equated this unborn fetus as a life or as a person. We've redefined because he's drawn a connection that's only tangentially related.
Well, what I think is so interesting about pursuer, there's agency. Like, this is someone who's after you. There's agency given to the fetus, right? Wow, that's really intense. It's very intense.
Right. It's as if the fetus wanted to destroy the mother's life.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to get to
after they're born to do that.
Yeah.
This would be a really gifted fetus.
Exactly.
So what we're going to see next, I've brought three different perspectives from three contemporary writers that really sort of shift their responses to the legalization of abortion in our country. And one of the things that we're going to see is that their motivations may influence how they write. I've tried to sort of bring from different denominations, but it's not as defined as they may be. So we're going to look at Walter Jacob, we're going to look at Blue Greenberg, and we're going to look at the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards of the conservative movement as sort of three different approaches. It does not mean that one is right and one is wrong, but as we saw from the Torah to the Mishnah to the medieval commentators, how these categories are sort of broadened and narrowed, we're going to say the same things for contemporary scholars, in that Maimonides has both narrowed it and widened it at the same time. Does that serve our purpose or not? Volunteer to read Walter Jacob. Bobby, you did a great job. Will you read this one too?
Okay, when is abortion permitted? CCAR responsum, a 20th century reform rabbi. The reform movement has had a long history of liberalism on many social and family matters. We feel that the pattern of tradition until the most recent generation has demonstrated a liberal approach to abortion and has definitely permitted it in case of any danger to the life of the mother. That danger may be physical or psychological. When this occurs at any time during the pregnancy, we would not hesitate to permit abortion. This would also include cases of incest and rape if the mother wishes to have an abortion. Those who are within the broadest range of permissibility permit abortion at any time before birth if there is serious danger to the health of the mother or the child. We would be in agreement with that liberal stance. We do not encourage abortion, nor favor it for trivial reasons, or sanction it, quote, on demand.
So how does he broaden the definition of danger to the life of the mother than what we've seen so far?
I think the clearest example is that not only do they take into consideration the life of the child, they take into the physical state of the mother, they also take into consideration the psychological state of the mother.
Right. So one of the things that sort of shifted after Maimonides, if we go back to Maimonides, is that the issue of a rodef, right? We really saw that as narrowing the category and giving person autonomy to the fetus. But one of the things that rodef also does is brings in the psychological aspect, because you as the victim have to define the nature and status of a pursuer as defined by your perceived threat. Because there are people who are trained or just gutsy or whatever other word you want to put on it, who would see somebody coming at them with a knife and think that they could negotiate that knife out of the person's hand. Whereas somebody else would either pull a gun or run. And our fight or flight plus more emotional response is introduced by Maimonides, but only after you look at the pursuer in the context of pursuer. So in some ways, as it's incredibly problematic that it puts person identity with a fetus that seems to contradict everything else, at the same time, it has opened the door for the whole emotional, psychological side of what abortion may do to the host of that pregnancy. What I can also appreciate is, even with stating a liberal view and a wide view, at the same time, they're basically saying, but this is not to be used as birth control. right? It should not be a given, but it is a right that everyone should have access to. And in fact, by listing certain conditions or instances, including rape and incest, are permissing even more the other ones, because the other texts would seem to say that if there's genetic issues that would prevent the child from living, or the mother is in such distress she cannot actually push this child out, is different to say what we know now about medicine and defining the potential life or condition of living of a fetus is very different. The other piece is that if I had to garner a guess, many children with genetic issues or physical issues would not live long in childhood, were still born, in part because they didn't have the ability to do ultrasounds in the Bible and in the Mishnah for pretty obvious reasons. And so their awareness of issues and using abortion as a tool not to have a live birth, even if that live birth is not viable, was very different. So we're using the same vocabulary today that they used then to some extent, but they have very different definitions just because of where we are medically and technologically today. But I would also say further in the understanding of women's autonomy as well. Blue Greenberg, volunteer to read. It's a lot. We'll break it down.
I can read it, Rabbi.
Thank you, Emily.
I tense at the thought of getting caught up in the controversy over abortion, emotionally, theologically, as a Jew, and most of all as a mother who is nurtured daily by the sights and sounds of her children. I'm opposed to abortion. And yet, the other facets of unwanted pregnancy cannot be ignored. Fatigued and harassed parents, the shame of rape, premature end of youth in the case of teenage pregnancy, the degradation and the danger of coat hanger abortions, and not least the overwhelming and exclusive claim of a child makes on a woman's life for many of her strongest years. I therefore have supported legalized abortion reform with the full knowledge of the ambivalence of my position. There are very few Jewish responsa dealing with abortion based on personal, economic, or family planning considerations. This can be understood historically. In the life of the traditional Jewish communities in pre-modern times, where even birth control was restricted carefully, and where the procreative function was high on the list of mitzvot, new life was valued, particularly so because life altogether was precarious. You had to have 8 children if you wanted 4 to survive. And until modern times, abortion was not common in the general culture. Jews in the diaspora always have been affected by the mores of the prevailing society. Furthermore, in our own day, when many Jews opt to have only 1 or 2 children, when the issue of abortion has assumed national importance, most Jews do not look to rabbinic guidance for decisions in these areas. Since there are no traditional Jewish precedents for abortion on demand, one way to maintain some integrity within the halakhic or Jewish legal framework would be to broaden the interpretation of therapeutic abortion to extend to the principle of precedence of the mother's actual life and health to include serious regard for the quality of life as well. Although one can envision a halakhic Jewish legal stance that urges avoidance of abortion for all the familiar traditional and theological reasons, the circumstances under which abortion is permissible may be widened. Such conditions may include the emotional inability to cope with childbearing and rearing, for example, the need to support oneself or one's spouse through school, the time required for a marriage to stabilize, overwhelming responsibilities to other children, and so forth. In these cases, abortion should be seen as a necessity rather than an evil. Indeed, many mitzvot are interdependent functions of timing and the conditions they regulate.
So how has she widened the traditional stance on abortion?
Yeah, she brings in the whole environment of the family or the individual And that goes even beyond the psychological. It is psychological, but it's based on what's occurring and what stage of life they're in, and economics, and how prepared, and how it's going to affect the whole unit.
Right. She takes the whole person approach, but also whole situation approach. The fascinating thing for me about Blue Greenberg's writing is that she gets very specific historically on how the number of children we have and the goals for our family have shifted, not in the decision to have an abortion or not, but that the reality of life and choices are different. And when she talks about modern day, with the issue of timing and responsibilities and stresses, she seems to get away from the classic gender roles of a relationship that seem to exist in previous texts. That the husband's job was to support the family and the woman's job was to raise the children. And what she says is the need to support oneself or one's spouse through school, for a marriage to stabilize, other responsibilities, etc. That all of those also play into family planning decisions that a couple may have that would also have the potential to cause the emotional turmoil for the mother. So if you're broadening the emotional aspect and approach, these are all additional factors outside of this one pregnancy that can be taken into consideration. Any comments before we look at our last text? Questions? Okay. So this is a statement of permissibility of abortion written by Rabbis Ben Sion Boxer and Castle Abelson. And this was an official law, Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards position. So the rabbis are listed. It was adopted on November 21st, 1983 by a vote of 16 to 1 as a summary of papers. So there were lots of different shuvot, lots of different responsa that were submitted on the issue of abortion. And this was a statement that was put out by the movement, signed onto by the members of the law committee. Volunteer to read it. Patty, will you take us home?
I will. Okay. Jewish tradition is sensitive to the sanctity of life and does not permit abortion on demand. However, it sanctions abortion under some circumstances because it does not regard the fetus as an autonomous person. This is based partly on the Bible, Exodus 21, 22, 23, which prescribes monetary damages where a person injures a pregnant woman, causing a miscarriage. The Mishnah, Ohalot 7:6, explicitly indicates that one is to abort a fetus if the continuation of pregnancy might imperil the life of the mother. Later authorities have differed as to how far we might go in defining the peril to the mother in order to justify an abortion. The Rabbinical Assembly Committee on Jewish Law and Standards takes the view that an abortion is justifiable if a continuation of pregnancy might cause the mother severe physical or psychological harm, or when the fetus is judged by competent medical opinion as severely defective. The fetus is a life in the process of development, and the decision to abort it should never be taken lightly. Before reaching her final decision, the mother should consult with the father, other members of her family, her physician, her spiritual leader, and any other person who can help her in assessing the many grave legal and moral issues involved.
So knowing that this was written in 1983, I wonder if that last line would be changed if it were writing today. To some extent, it's the woman's body, her choice. And yet at the same time, a woman does not necessarily always, I mean, technically could, right, self-inseminate. But oftentimes there should be two people who make that decision, and not that it's a husband's or male's decision to make. But my hope is that that consultation will be for the support system that the woman will have in supporting her decision. Whether it's arms to hold or meals to prepare or laundry to help with, whatever that support is, that it exist and be there for the person. But the one thing that this sort of shifts is it talks about the fetus is a life in the process of development. Not that it's an actualized life, but it's a potential life. And that notion of potential life is a term that's brought up oftentimes in the pro-life point of views and writings. That potential life should be seen to fruition, which is not the same as what the conservative movement is officially stating here. And so we get into sort of issues and controversy when we talk about pro-life, which I would say all Jewish sources are pro-life, based upon that first text plus more, the pru or vu, but they are pro-choice and pro-life of mother above the definition of pro-life, because pro-life they define as the life of the mother, the actualized real life that exists, not the potential life within the mother. Any questions? Comments? Thoroughly confused?
So do
So
you
what's
think
the-
that this that the Christian viewpoint has evolved and become more favoring the potential life over time? Do you have a knowledge or awareness of Christianity and how that has evolved?
If I had to garner the single issue voters or self-proclaimed single issue voters who are pro-life, are basing their voting and choices on a biblical injuncture that's not fully understood in a correctness, that has the potential to ignore everything else that they're doing that conflicts with biblical injunctions. And that I could see somebody Jewish, although I would argue that they shouldn't, but I could see somebody Jewish being a single issue voter for pro-choice, based upon the understanding of texts and the importance of valuing a mother's life. Having said that, single issue voters for pro-life or primary issue voters for pro-life have defined life as the potential life of the fetus and put that life higher than the life of the mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hesitating to state, but if I had to guess, it's because that potential life may be male and not necessarily guaranteed female.
Oh, gee.
Patty.
So this last text it points out that today medical science, you can determine whether the fetus has some disability or genetic disorder, but it doesn't say that that makes the fetus dangerous to the mother. So it seems to be a different category of decision making.
Right. So there's also additional issues and categories of decision making. If somebody needs a DNC, which is they've miscarried, but they're not naturally passing the fetus on their own, they need a medical intervention to help. And so whether that's what you call cutting the fetus out of the womb, or whether you call that abortion, has a very different meaning if you have confirmation that the fetus is no longer alive. But when you lump all of abortion or all of miscarriage, whether medical or natural, into one category, and close abortion clinics and safe ways of getting the care that you need because of fear of a potential life without taking into account the non-potential life that are still being carried, then you run all sorts of risks and damage to the whole notion of what it means to care for our community. So I'll share one personal story in the last minute we have. I am the oldest of 3 girls. And my mother, sort of unabashedly, although I wonder if she'd do anything differently now, would say to us that had anything been genetically wrong with the 3rd pregnancy, they would have aborted. Because it was financially tight enough with 2 kids, with loans, with debt, just trying to get by, stress on the relationships in all directions. And when they found out that she was healthy according to ultrasounds, I have 2 sisters now. But that comes into the Blue Greenberg conversations about what that means as well in terms of the whole picture and what we look at. So thank you all. I'm not sure if we're getting kicked out of the rooms or whether they're leaving them open. I got mixed messages. The timing clock went down, but there was also a message that we weren't going to leave. So thank you for coming both to this class and to Torathon in general. And I hope that we have many more opportunities to learn and study and grow together.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. This was great.
Thank you.
Shavua tov.
Can I just leave room? Do we need to see any more?
And Stephen, the Federation is always so supportive. We're very grateful.